All right, good evening. A good moed. Hope everyone is doing well. We're learning Maseches Yevamos daf mem dalid, and we're starting at the very bottom of mem gimel amid beis at a fresh Mishnah, 4 lines from the bottom of the page. Housekeeping note: we're going to be learning daf Yomi tomorrow morning after the 6:30 shacharis, be'erech at about 7:30 here. If you're able to make it, great. If not, there will be a recording. Tomorrow's daf is the sugya about if a woman gets pregnant from a non-Jewish man, whether or not the child is a mamzer, the flow within the Tanaim and Amoraim and the Psak and the Gemara. I think we know how we paskin, but whatever cliffhanger there is in this sugya, we'll save until tomorrow. So Mem Gimel Amid Beis 4 lines from the bottom. The Mishnah writes, Arba Achin Nisuin Arba Nashim Umesu. Don't get scared. This isn't a complex case. These are 4 men who are brothers, who are married to 4 women who are not sisters. So this is a cleaner case. So let's say the four Klein brothers, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, they all marry 4 random women. So, and then they all die. So says the Gemara, Im Ratza Hagadol Shebehem Liyabim Eskulim, if the oldest of them would like to do Yibum Harishus Biyado, he's allowed. After all, he has a requirement to be Mekayim Zer of his brother. And there are 4 brothers that died. He's the 5th brother, as we'll see in the Gemara. The Gemara is going to articulate that there were only 4 brothers and then the oldest one married. That's a little, obviously it's just a linguistic issue, but we'll get there in a moment. But that guy, the oldest brother of all, the remaining brother, I should say, of all the 4 who died, is able to marry all 4 of those spouses. Why the number 4? We'll discuss that in the Gemara as well. Not a similar case. One man is married to 2 women, umeis, and then he died. Then, if one of his brothers chooses to marry or do chalitza to one of those women, that's fine. The other woman then needs nothing else. And at the top of Mem Daled Amud Aleph, the Gemara reminds us of a din that we saw many blot ago, 30 plus blot ago, that if of these 2 women, one is kosher and one is pasal, so if of the 2 sisters, one of them is anyways not able to marry a kohen, that is the one to whom you should do chalitza, because doing chalitza will make a woman into a chalutza, and then she cannot marry a kohen. So once she's already a chalutza, then we should do chalitza for her. And if you're going to do yibum, you should make sure to do yibum to a woman who's not psula kahuna. You don't want to make the pool any smaller. Kohanim already have some limitations about who they can marry, and we want to be sensitive about that. It's just interesting, like the marriage of a Yavam to Yevamos is very sincere. And we saw this with Chakir already. Like, can you marry someone l'shem noi, l'shem ishus? We saw this discussion right in the Tanaim. It's even telling you who to marry. Like, it's not, you should just marry the other one, like almost irrelevant of personality. It's a very sharp din. The din of Yibum it's not a pasha d'zach. It's not a simple thing. And the Gemara is saying that if one of the sisters is a grusha, whatever the case may be, then she should be the one who gets the chalitza, so as not to shrink the pool of those to whom Kohanim can marry. As mentioned, the Mishnah had a very strange language. The Mishnah opened with Arba Achin. There were 4 brothers who were married and they all died. And then magically a 5th brother appeared in the Mishnah that he was the oldest one, or the remaining brother who was able to do Yibum to the other 4. Says the Gemara, Arba Achin Sal Kadaitach, you got the number wrong. It really should be 5. Elaima, you're right. We have to play with the language of the Mishnah, and it should be Arba Me Achin, 4 of the brothers. A family that has a lot of boys, more than 4 or 5 at least, fine. Next case, Harishus Biyado, we said that this 5th brother is able to marry the 4 women who are the Yevamos of his 4 brothers. Says the Gemara, B'Shavkile, they're going to let him do that? Tanya, after all, the pasuk says in regards to the world of Yibum, the elders are called. What's the drasha there? Hein v'lo shluchin. They're the zakanim of the ear. They speak directly to the people. There's no shaliach between the dayan and the people going through the process. What does it mean with dibru elav? Melame, the pasuk means shemasin lo eitza hogeneslo. The bezdin gives eitza when people are doing yibum. They got to make sure that it makes sense. For example, shim hayahu yeled v'hizikena, or hu zaken v'hi yalda. If the age gap is massive, then they'll say omrim lo. They're going to say to the husband, malach eitzel yalda, malach eitzel zakena, kalach eitzel shekam oscha ve'al tasim ktata beveisecha. Yeah, it's not shaykh. She's 60, you're 15, or vice versa. Like, it's not shaykh. So you got to make sure that it makes sense. So we have the chachamim who are going to be giving out eitzah. And what are they going to say in this case? You got 5 brothers. 4 of the brothers died. Women are not related to one another. All 4 women fall b'yibum to the one brother who's alive. You're going to say you have a din of yibum by every single sibling. That's just, it's not a good idea. So says the Gemara, lo tzricha de'efshar le. No, they would give advice, but this guy is very wealthy. He can handle the bills. He's a millionaire, a billionaire. He's able to support the 4 women of his brothers. And being mekayim zera le'achicha, he's able to keep his brother's memory alive 4 times over. His 4 brothers' memories 4 times over. Fine. Says the Gemara, if so, why then did the Mishnah position the case with only 4 brothers? If what you're saying is that it's all about the money and because he's efshar le, then no problem. So what if there's 12 boys and the 13th boy was the one who had all of the Yevamos fault? So marry all 12 of them. Why did the Mishnah say 4? And the Gemara here gives a very important answer, hashkafically and halachically. Eitza tova kamash malan. The Mishnah says 4 to teach us something wise. Dalet in tfelo. 4 women, that's acceptable in regards to Yibum, but more than that is unacceptable. Why? To make sure that one can be available to one's spouse for the mitzvah of ona. We know that onas talmidei chachamim is once weekly, from Friday night to Friday night. Friday night is lav dafka, but that's the idea that's mentioned in poskim. From Friday night to Friday night, that's considered acceptable for the onas talmidei chachamim. And that's a mitzvah saseh, that a husband is obligated to be available to his wife. So if that's true, how can you be available to your wife when you have 4 wives? So that says the Gemara, that's the maximum of Eitza Tova, to make sure that each woman can have their ona on a semi-regular basis. Shifting over a quarter of the way down or so, the Mishnah said the case of the one man who was married to 2 women and then he died. Says the Gemara, why is it that our Mishnah says that you should do chalitza or yibum to one and the other goes off scot-free? Why can't you do yibum to both of them? Now remember, this case is not like our first case. Our first case was 4 brothers and they all fell b'yibum. Their wives all fell b'yibum. Here it's one man whose 2 wives fell to a brother b'yibum. It's not the same case. So why here are we saying that you cannot do yibum? Because Amar Reb Chia bar Abba, Amar Reb Yochanan, Amar Kra, the pasuk says, "Asher lo yivneh es beis achiv, bais echad hu boneh ve'ein boneh shnei batim." It's not appropriate to marry 2 of the Yevamos, even if they're not related to one another, because the din is to be mekayim zera for the brother, and you're doing that with one of the spouses. No need for that to be done with 2 of the spouses. And a third of the way down on Mem Daled Amar Aleph, the Gemara says, why don't we do chalitza to both of the women? V'nachlos l'tarvayu. That's another iteration that our Mishnah didn't seem to consider. Amar Marzucha Bar Tivya, of course the Mishnah considered it. Amar Kra beis chalut tanal, bais echad hu choletz ein choletz shnei batim. It's not halachically appropriate to do chalitza to both. So then again, we're where we are standing, which is that we're under the assumption that we either have to do chalitza or yibum to one, and the other will go off scot-free. So then asks the Gemara, why don't we do a different version still? Why don't we do yibum to one and chalitza to the other? So here the Gemara raises 2 concerns. Concern number 1, the Gemara says, is Amar Kra, im lo yachpotz. The pasuk says if he doesn't want to do yibum, he can do chalitza. But if he wants to, he can do yibum. We've seen this idea many times already throughout the Masechta. Most recently, about 20 blot ago, actually even less probably, but the Maseches Hashas quotes one on daf chaf, but I think we saw this idea earlier, since then I should say, which is that we have to have it be a real case. And because you can't do yibum to both, because you've already been mekayim zara, so then you have to let one of them go. And because the chalitza you're doing for that woman is not really one that's a possibility with yibum, so therefore it's invalid. That's concern number 1. And furthermore, shelo yomro beis mikzaso banui mikzaso chalutz. We also don't want people to say that only half of his house is built. This man had 2 wives, and one of the wives was b'yibum, and the other one was b'chalitza. That doesn't look nice. Says the Gemara, just about halfway down on Mem Daled Amar Aleph, nu b'yomru. Who cares? Everyone understands he had 2 wives. He couldn't marry both of them. So let it be that he did chalitza to one and yibum to another. Says the Gemara, I agree with you a little bit. If you did yibum first and then you did chalitza afterwards, you're absolutely right. That would be a valid, viable option, halachically speaking. Ella, the reason why we don't allow that, where we do yibum first and chalitza after, is because it's very easy to mix up the order. That if a man has 2 Yevamos that are from one husband, and he does accidentally chalitza first, so then he no longer has a din of yivneh beso, building his brother's family. It's over. Yeah, the mitzvah is gone, and you're not allowed to marry that second woman. And therefore, we don't allow even to do the other way, which is the right way, which is to do yibum first followed by chalitza. Says the Gemara. So let's just do a quick chazar up here. We tried to understand a few of the iterations of our Mishnah as to why it is that if there's one man who has two wives and he dies, that these two wives who are not related to one another fall to a brother for yibum. Why is it that our Mishnah says that we do yibum and or chalitza to one? We do yibum or chalitza to one, and the other goes off scot-free. And we went through a few iterations of why we can't do all the other things. Okay, Ve'ema, says the Gemara. This is a very crazy havamina. We've seen a couple of unique limits of yibum, and here's another one. Maybe we should say when there's only one wife that's falling b'yibum from a husband, tiskai mitzvah yibum, that's when we'll have the mitzvah of yibum. But when a man taka has two wives, then lo tiskai mitzvah yibum, because what we're saying is that the psukim don't seem to give a lot of latitude for two wives. Bais echad, in regards to, you only have to do yibum for one wife, and even by chalitza, based chalutza now, you only have to do one wife. So then maybe be'etzem, there's no din of yibum when there are multiple wives. Now we know from this Masechta that that's not true. We know already that there's a din of yibum in it. We said if there's two brothers, fine. We've seen many cases of this already, so we already know that it's wrong, and the Gemara rejects it as follows: Im kain, if it were to be true that there was only a din of yibum, there was only a mitzvah of yibum when there's only one wife who falls by yibum. Im kain, tzaras erva da asar rachman alamali. How many times have we seen the drashas of litzror that we know that there's an isha who's a tzara, the other wife, and the psukim speak about her explicitly? Of course, there's a mitzvah of yibum. Of course, there's a mitzvah of yibum when we talk about having two wives, having a co-wife. It says the Gemara, hashta beis be'alma, two random women, amris lab bnei chalitza v'yibum. You can't do both. So therefore, tzaras erva mibaya. Obviously, that doesn't make any sense. If what you're saying is true, that there's no mitzvah of yibum or chalitza with two women, then certainly we wouldn't need the psukim to say women who are co-wives to the same man. For sure, that's true. So says the Gemara, that's not a good argument. Even if you were to say that the mitzvah of yibum only applies when there's one spouse, you still need the pasuk to speak about litzror. Alamalo, why would I not have needed that in the pasuk? Itzrich, I would have needed it for the following logic. Had it been that a man had two wives, a regular wife, Chana and Penina, a regular wife and a co-wife, and really, even if it was the din that the mitzvah of yibum only applies when there's only one wife, we still need the pasuk. Sal kadaita chamina, 2/3 of the way down, 4 lines before the next Mishnah. Sal kadaita chamina amina erva avroi kaima. Maybe because the erva, if the first wife is an erva, and therefore inherently she's totally forbidden to the yavam, we might have thought v'tisyabeim tzarasa, that really because the first wife who's an erva, is completely forbidden to the husband, so maybe it's as though she doesn't exist in regards to the mitzvah of yibum, and the only wife that does exist is the one that she's allowed to marry, which is the tzara. Kamash malan de asira, says the Gemara, no matter what, we need the pasuk. Ella, therefore, how do we know? Fundamental question: how do we know that the mitzvah of yibum applies even when there's more than one wife? And the Gemara answers, it's not from svara, it's only from drasha. And as we close up at the 2 dots here, Ella yivimto riba. The reason that we know that there is a din of yibum, even when there's more than one wife who falls by yibum, the reason we know that to be true is because of the drasha of yivimto. At the 2 dots just before the new Mishnah, why is it that we have to make sure that when a man has 2 wives and one of them is already a grusha and a surah to kohanim, why do we have to make sure that that's the one who gets chalitza if he does chalitza? And the kshera, the one who has no limitations, that she's the one who gets yibum? Says the Gemara, and we saw this Gemara earlier as well, Amar Rav Yosef, Kan Shana Rebbe, Lo yishpoch adam me'borav acherem tzrichim lo. You should not pour out the water from your pit when others need it. I don't know that this is a mashal we should bring to the Shabbos table as a reference to your spouse, but nevertheless, the Gemara is making a point, is don't spill out the water if someone else can use it. Yeah, you can't marry her because you're a Kohen and she's a Grusha, but a regular Yisrael can marry her. There's no reason to do chalitza around her and make things worse, or just marry her, or don't marry her, depending on the status, whatever makes the most sense. That brings us to a new Mishnah. The new Mishnah is 2/3 of the way down, and the Mishnah has a machlokas Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim. Here are the cases that they argue about. Hamachzir grushaso, if a man is married, let's say that Reuven is married to Rachel, they get divorced. Rachel in the meantime marries another man, Chaim, and then they get divorced. And now Reuven wants to remarry his initial wife. This is what we refer to as Hamachzir grushaso, and Rashi adds in the keywords Mishanises. Rashi says you're remarrying the woman you were married to after she'd been married to another man. That's case number one. So if a man marries his chalutza, krovas chalutza, and a man who marries the relative of his chalutza, in all of these cases, Yotzi, you must get divorced. Vlad mamzer divi Rabbi Akiva. In all of these cases of machzor grushaso, ve'anose chalutzaso, ve'anose krovas chalutzaso, all of these cases, the children that are born from them are considered mamzerim midoraisa. Done deal. We'll have to see if it's din doraisa. The Chachamim say, Ein havlad mamzer, they disagree. However, as the Mishnah closes, umodim, they do agree. Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim agree in the case of benose krovas gerushaso shavlad mamzer. They agree that if one marries the relative of a gerusha, so if the gerusha was someone that you're not allowed to marry, you can't marry that person's relative, that the vlad is a mamzer. Asks the Gemara on the Shita of Rabbi Akiva, how can Rabbi Akiva say?
The last line, nose kruvas grushaso, means what? The mother of somebody's ex-wife?
No, it means a family member of a woman who's a grusha.
Same thing. A family member.
Say that there's a grusha, her sister.
Yeah, so I said the man marries his ex-mother-in-law. Or ex-sister-in-law.
Ex-sister-in-law, yeah.
I was trying to stay away from sister because that's a little more complicated.
I think the mother-in-law piece was more complicated, but that's just because of me. I lost you in the generation jump there, but I know, yeah, that's what it means. Yeah, that's shot in the case there. And take a look at Rashi at the end of the Mishnah to clarify. He does a better job than anybody. The grushaso ki ishto ve'achosa o ima chay dekrisa nalagabe. The two cases you mentioned, they're both there. Yeah.
So even it's grushaso, he's still stuck.
Even what?
It's grushaso. It's like he's still stuck.
Yeah, she's basically. I mean, Rashi really he captures it. It's still like a din ki ishto. It's like achos ishto. Right. Yeah, kind of. Yeah, exactly.
She'd have to die for those other things.
Probably. Yeah, we say that by achos ishto. Yeah, we say that by achos ishto. That if the sister dies, who's the one who's usher to, you can marry the other one. Correct.
Okay. It's only the sister, though, I think. The pasuk is specifically by the sister.
Right, that's why
But Rashi includes here. I mean, we're not really speaking about what happens if she dies. That's not our sugya right now. We're just talking about this guy having a child with the krova. So I don't know.
That's actually a month.
But with what? Yeah, but what would happen in the case that we're discussing? If the woman who's usher to you dies, can you then marry the mother? That's beyond the pale here. It might still be usher because it might.
Yeah,
I don't know. Right. So here the Gemara opens with a question about something we learned in the Resha. We've learned in this Masechta a number of times that a chalutza may not be an Isser D'Oraisa as it relates to the actual marriage of a Kohen, that it might be D'Rabbanan. So what we're bothered by here is that Rabbi Akiva calls this child a mamzer, and nevertheless, we have Mari Makomos that don't seem to agree with that. The Savar Rabbi Akiva Hanose Krovas Chalutza so Havlad Mamzer. Does Rabbi Akiva really hold that if one marries the relative of a chalutza, that the child is a mamzer? After all, first long line, V'amar Reish Lakish, Kan Shana Rebbe, Achos Grusha, Midivrei Torah, Achos Chalutza, Midivrei Torah. The sister of a Chalutza is only a din d'Rabbanan. So how can you tell me in the Mishnah Rabbi Akiva that the krova of a Chalutza is a mamzer? I read the Mishnah says that the marriage of the sister of a Chalutza is only a din d'Rabbanan. That's a great question. So much so that the Gemara, in its first presentation of an answer, changes the language of the Brisa. Our Brisa has on line number 2 of the Mishnah, Hanose Chalutzaso. And here the Gemara says, Tani, we should change it to Krovas Grushaso. We should change it to the relative of the Grusha. Fine. Still not so simple because the next case is Hanose Krovas Chalutzaso, because that's still a case of Chalutza, but both cases are then pretty similar. So then the Gemara says, Tani Krovas Grushaso. And Hachanami Mistabra, this is actually logical because the Katani Seifa Modim, that they do admit to one another that benose krovas krushaso shavlad mamzer. And if we don't change the language of our Mishnah to krovas krushaso, then when they say umodim, they're not falling back on anything in the previous part of our Mishnah. Normally, when you have a machlokas and it's followed up by a modim, is that Beis Hillel holds X, Beis Shammai holds Y, but they're modim in one case where they both agree. But that's usually referencing a case that already exists. And that's why the Gemara says as follows. If in fact the Mishnah had already been including this case of krovas krushaso, the new answer here, the change of our Mishnah, then hanu diktani modim, I could understand why the Mishnah would say, but they actually do agree in this one case. I could understand that. But if in fact the Mishnah doesn't have this new language of krovas krushaso, my umodim, what then would be the language of a modim. Says the Gemara, that's really not a good argument because Vidilma Hakamashmalan, what it's teaching us is the Yesh Mamzer Mechayve Krisus, that you can have a mamzer that's created from an Isser Krisus. It doesn't have to be that it's a case that already is pre-existing in the Mishnah. Maybe they just both agree to a different case, and that's what they're being moded to. Says the Gemara, that we already learned. We don't need our Mishnah to teach us that Chayve Krisus are mamzerim. Haktani Lelekaman. We learn later on in the Masechta, not too far, another 5 days or so, says the Gemara, Ezehu mamzer, kol she'er basar, shehu below yavo, divrei Rabbi Akiva. Any family member who's in the Isra of lo yavo, that's what Rabbi Akiva says. But we don't need his opinion for right now. We need Rabbi Shimon HaTeimani. What does he say? Rabbi Shimon HaTeimani Omer, kol she'chayav and alav kares b'dei shamayim, that anyone who has an Isra kares in the tashmish hamita, then the resulting child will be a mamzer, just categorically, very simple. You don't have to worry about marriage. You don't have to worry about nothing. As long as there's an Isser Kares, then the child is a mamzer. And v'halacha kidvarav. So if you wanted to tell me that, no, it's okay. Really, the Mishnah wasn't talking about krovas grushaso earlier on, and they're just mentioning it in the Seifa, and that's to teach me about Kares. That's not possible because the Mishnah on Mem Tes already teaches us that. Says the Gemara, 7 lines from the bottom from Mem Dal and Medale. Do you have a question?
Is that Nida also?
Sleeping with a nida.
Kares.
That is cars.
Any Isser Kares is gonna generate a child as a mamzer.
We'll get there.
It's a lot harder to know than with all the other ones.
What do you mean?
Saying if somebody, I mean.
Oh, you're saying you just don't know if she's like she
If a
is.
woman, who's, I don't know, not married, it gets.
Hate to be one, but if someone is
Right.
if she's not makbid on tashmish amita, she's probably not makbid on bedikos either.
Yeah.
So then the odds are she isn't either doraisa. Just I mean, Moshe Feinstein has this whole tshuva. What about all the bali tshuva? Their kids are tzaddikim. They're not rishayim. So obviously they go swimming in them. He's that beautiful. That's beautiful. I'm just saying. But if you have someone, not because they're about their tinok shenishba that they're having tashmish amita, they're just not from. I think it's a little bit more aggressive. In this case, when you're comparing nida, she's probably not. There's two peas in a pod. If you're makbid on tashmish amita, then you're probably more likely to be makbid on hilchos nida. But you're right; it would be hard to know. It'd be very hard to know. Kares is a din in shamayim. It's not a din in bezdin, so it doesn't. I don't know that it matters to us in bezdin terms. But, anyways, that's what the Gemara says over here. V'dilma kasasim lantana krib shemen atemani, and the Gemara says, well, maybe what's happening over here in our Mishnah is that by repeating the fact, or at least implying that there is a din of kares, and that we paskin that way, it's to say that we hold like Shemen Atemani, that we hold that Chayve Krisus generate a child who's a mamzer. Im Kain, says the Gemara, listen, Shar Chayve Krisus. Why then does our Mishnah only speak about one case? There's 50 cases of Krisus, however many cases there are of Krisus that the Tashmish Amita could generate such a scenario of a mamzer. Krovas grusha solamali. Why then only specifically was that case mentioned? Alashmami no Iriba. It must therefore be like our answer number one was that we have to change the language of our Mishnah. That in the ratio of the Mishnah we change the case of chalutzaso to a case of krovas grushaso. Says the Gemara, Vidilma, maybe that's still not true. La'olam lo Iriba. I did the ton of master grushaso and also chalutzaso krovas chalutzaso, because in one part of the Mishnah it uses this language. Taninama krovas grushaso. We also use that language as well, but it's lav davka that it was already existing in the Mishnah. We don't have to change the language of the Mishnah, and therefore this approach of answer number one of changing the language of the Mishnah is no longer correct, and therefore we have to move on to the second possible answer as to how to understand the shita of Rabbi Akiva. And here we're in for a bit of a surprise. Ella, 3 lines from the bottom, krovas chalutzas Rabbi Akiva have mamzer. Even though Rabbi Akiva did hold that sleeping with the sister of a chalutza is an isser derabanan, Rabbi Akiva doesn't agree. Rabbi Akiva argues, machlokas tanaim, as to whether or not tashmish amita with this woman would generate, with a chalutza, with the achos chalutza would generate a mamzer, yes or no. Rabbi Akiva is very makbid, and he holds against Rabbi that the isra of achos chalutza so is not an isra derabanan. He holds it's an isra deraisa. Amar Rav Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Hainu time of Rabbi Akiva. Where does Rabbi Akiva learn this from? So says the Gemara, the Amar Kra beis chalutzana la kasu kro beiso. What does the Torah refer to the chalutza as? Beiso. Oh, that's a beautiful diuk from the Psukim, It almost sounds obvious that if the pasuk is going to refer to a chalutza as beso, beis chalutza now, if we're going to use the language of beso by a chalutza, what's beso? That's his wife. So even though it's true that the chalitza separates them, but the fact that the chalitza happened identified a tethering between that woman and her chalutz, and therefore Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion that a tashmish amita with the achos chalutzaso would still be an isur doraisa and still be kares. Huge machlokas tanaim. I mean, that is a massive chasm between a child being a mamzer and the tashmish amita only being an isur d'rabbanan. I mean, that's just a wild gap in shitas. You don't see things like this. So I mean, we see machlokas, but like when you look at a machlokas, they're usually pretty narrow. Do you do smicha on the animal? It's very simple. It's glad. This is mamish yochayv kares, and the other side, it's like, okay, you really shouldn't have done it. It's makas mardus, let's call it. If you're really in the times of it, you get a slap on the wrist. Okay. For the remainder of the day today, we're going to be learning a memra of Rav Yosef. The problem is we don't know exactly what the memra of Rav Yosef was. So we're going to learn the first version now, and then we'll pivot over to the second version shortly. Bottom line of Mem Daled Amud Aleph. Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Rav Shimon Berebi. Hakol modim, everyone agrees, b'machzer grushaso, that if a man remarries his ex-wife after she had been married to another man, shavlad pagum lekahuna. This is his line, that everyone says that this child is pagum lekahuna. No, not mamzer, but just what does it say in our Mishnah in this case? So we had said this is a machlokas. The Chachamim say that in this case of machzer grushaso, Rabbi Akiva said it was vlad mamzer, and the Chachamim say it's not. So this line is clearly in line with the Chachamim because he doesn't say that it's a mamzer. Shavlad pagum lekehuna. Rashi shavlad pagum v'im yalda bas psula lekehuna kechalala. And the daughter of this marriage, of this bond, would end up being a chalala. Says the Gemara, when we say man hakol modim, we know it's not actually that everyone agrees to that because our Mishnah has Rabbi Akiva who doesn't agree to this. So obviously his language is meant to include something. It's Omer Dorsheni. Who did you mean to include by saying hakol modim, that this child has a pigam? Says the Gemara, Shimon HaTeimani, who we just learned about. Diafal gav de Amar Shimon HaTeimani ein mamzer mechayve lavin. Even though Shimon HaTeimani holds that a mamzer cannot be generated from a tashmish amita that's only an isur lav, he holds that it has to be an isur kares. Still, nehida mamzer lohavi, granted in this case of the machzer grushaso, that he's not a mamzer, but pagum miyahave. However, the child is considered a pagum, and therefore he'd have limitations with kehuna. And where does this idea come from? Mikal v'chomer me'almana. This is an idea we saw already yesterday. What's the kal v'chomer from an almana? Uma almana lekohen gadol she'eni sur shavet b'chol b'na pagum. Just like an almana, whose limitations to a kohen gadol are very unique. She's not across the board forbidden to everyone, not even to all kohanim, but she is usher to the kohen gadol. So there, eini surah shavet b'chol. Not everyone has the same tethering to her, yet we still see b'na pagum. Zo, our case of the machzer grushaso she'isura shavet b'chol, which does apply across the boards to kohanim. Eino din shabna pagum. All the more so, this kid's going to be pagum. Fine. So says the Gemara, a whole host of questions on this kal v'chomer. The next 10, 12 lines are questions on this kal v'chomer, and then we're going to try and answer all of them. We're going to fail, and because we're going to fail, we're going to circle back and re-understand Rav Yosef's initial statement. So let's see what the challenges are. First of all, says the Gemara, 6 lines down on Mem Daled Amud Beis, Ika l'mifrach. Whenever we see the phrase Ika l'mifrach, it means we can ask a tough question. And in this case, it means we can ask a tough question on the kal v'chomer from Almana. Ika l'mifrach, ma'le almana sheken hi atzma mischaleles. An almana is unique, is that she is inherently psula. That's very different. She's the one who's mischaleles. Number 2, ve'od hi to'eva ksiv. The pasuk indicates this black on white that she is the to'eva. And what's the drasha? Ve'ein baneha to'avin. The halacha doesn't trickle down to her kids like you wanted to say, Rav Yosef. Ve'od, and furthermore, Tanya, the Brisa writes, this is a longer Brisa, a machzer grusha, so a man who remarries his wife after she'd been married to another person, ve'anose chalutzaso, and a man who marries his chalutza, ve'anose krovas chalutzaso. Here we have a machlokas. Now our Mishnah that we learned at the bottom of the previous page is quite similar, but not identical to this Mishnah. 12 lines down, Rabbi Akiva Omer, ein lo ba kiddushin ve'ein sricha himenu get ve'hipsula ve'vlada pasol ve'kofen oso lahotzi. In all of these relationships, Rabbi Akiva says there is no kiddushin. She doesn't even need a get, and she's psula, and the child is pasol, and they're forced to get divorced. There actually is, the mechanics of kedushin do work here. And therefore they would need a get upon their separation. The mother is ksher, v'vlada kosher. So Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim, they have their party lines from one Mishnah to the next. Everything seems kafta referach so far. So says the Gemara over here analyzing this brisa, when the Chachamim say that the child is kosher, liman, who is the child kosher to? Lav lekahuna. Doesn't it imply that the child is going to be kosher to a Kohen? Says the Gemara, no, lo, lekahal, just to tell you that the kid's not a mamzer and that he's able to marry into the Jewish people. Ihachi, says the Gemara, what does it mean when it says he kshera in the name of the Chachamim, that she's allowed to be ksher leman? Who is that according to? Like who is she allowed to marry? Obviously, she's allowed to marry in Mishum Dezanya Ifsula Lakal, because a woman chooses to have an inappropriate halachic relationship with someone. It doesn't mean she can never marry again. It's a very bad idea. You're probably not going to get a trust award for having done something so inappropriate, but still, you're not asur to the kal. Everybody knows that she's muteres to the kal, even if she does something wrong. Elalav, it must therefore be that when the Chachamim say he kshera, is talking about lekahuna, and then the Gemara says it seems to be that because she is psula to the kahuna, so the child would also have, because she is kshera to the kahuna, so the vlad should also be kshera to the kahuna, and this is a big question mark on the kal v'chomer that we said above. So says the Gemara Midi Irya, does that make sense? Do we have to assume that whatever the limitations are on the mother apply to the child? That was the logic that we just employed. We said that because the din of the mother is that she's ksher to the Kohen, and therefore her kid must be also. Says the Gemara, no, hakid isa v'hakid isa. Maybe the din of the mother is not the same as that of the father. This does partially answer our question, because you are saying that maybe the ben, he can't have a psul, and this says, no, the ben can still have a psul because the mother and the son don't have to have the same halachic status. And hachanami mistabra, this is actually very logical to assume that the halachic status of the mother as it relates to Kohanim and that of the child are not the same. Where do we see this? We see this with the Shita Rabbi Akiva. Diktana Reisha, in regards to Rabbi Akiva, what did he say? He psula bevlada pasal. He said that she is psula and the child is pasal. Now let's analyze his Shita. When it says he psula, that the woman herself is psula, leman, who is that referring to? Ilema lekahal. If you want to say that she's psula to the kahal, mishum dezanya ifsula leilakal, that doesn't make sense. As we saw above, she would not become psula to the kahal just because she had tash mashamita that was aser. Elalav, it must be lekahuna that she's psula. And what does it mean when it says vlada pasal leman? Ilema lekahuna halakal kasher ham Rabbi Akiva vlad mamzer. It's not even close. So you have a case scenario where she's muteres and he is Vlad Mamzer. Ela pshita lekal. It must be that we're talking about the kal. Umida reisha, because by Rabbi Akiva we say hakad isa v'hakad isa, that the din of the mother by definition has to be different than that of the son. So to seifanami by the din of the chachamim hakad isa v'hakad isa. So we've solved one of our problems because we tried to undermine the kal v'chomer by saying that the din of the mother and the son have to be the same. What about the next halacha the next question that we pose about a third of the way down? So now we're on the first of the long lines, and the Gemara says we had said above, what about the pasuk v'hito eva nami? We have an answer for that one. We had said above that when it says v'hito eva, it says that there's a difference between her and her son. Says the Gemara, no, that's not the diuk in the pasuk. Hito eva ve'ein sarasa to eva. However, aval boneha to'ave. The drasha makes much more sense this way, to say that the drasha on the mother is about her tzara, has nothing to do with the kid, and the kid could be a to'eva as well. So it says the Gemara, we answered that question too. Ela almana kasha. We still do have a challenge about one uniqueness about an almana, one that we have yet to solve for, and that is male almana sheken hi atzma mitzchalelas, that the mother herself she has a uniqueness. What is her uniqueness? I should have learned this Rashi earlier with you, but I didn't. Look at Rashi on the top line of the page. Rashi says, Dibur hamaschel sheken hi atzma mitzchalelas she meis kohen gadol asura afilu lekohen hedjod. Very unique din that once the almana has tashmish amita with the kohen gadol, then she becomes a chalala even to all the other kohanim. So then she has an inherent psul. So back to where we are, if that's true, then our initial line of Rav Yosef that we started with at the bottom of Mem Daled Amud Aleph, where he said that in the case of machzer grushaso, that the child has a pigam, that's not necessarily true. And therefore, we have to re-understand the shita of Rav Yosef. So 10 lines from the bottom, 3 lines into the wide lines, the Gemara says, Mem Daled Amud Beis, Ella, I itmar hachi itmar, a well-known line. The phrase of I itmar hachi itmar always means whatever we thought we understood about the previous Amoraic statement was probably wrong and we should try again. If there was such a statement, this is probably what it was. And the Gemara attempts another one. Amar Rav Yosef on Reb Shimon Rebbe, Hakol Modim Beba al Chayve Krisos Shal Vlad Pagum. Everyone agrees that if there's tashmish amita between a man and a woman and the tashmish itself is bechayve krisos, everyone agrees that the vlad is pagum. Now this is different than the previous statement of Rav Yosef, because the previous statement of Rav Yosef was specifically about machzir grushaso. This is more broad. This is all cases of chayve krisos. Did you have a question?
Yeah, well, I would have guessed Chayve Krisos would produce a mamzer.
That's a shita too. We saw that.
I think so.
It doesn't matter how we pass it. I'm saying that we had machlokes tanaim about it, whether or not that was what we saw about. Was that who was that? Yeah, that was Rav Shimon HaTeimani. So that was the brayso on the bottom of Mem Daled Amud Aleph, where there was a machlokes tanaim about that. Rav Shimon HaTeimani holds, like you were saying, kol shechayavan alav kares bidei shamayim, and v'halacha kidvarav. It seems to be that we pass in that way. However, it is a machlokes.
Maybe don't pass it this way.
What?
So this statement of Rav Yosef might be we just don't pass it this way.
Could be. We'll have to look in Shulchan Aruch. Yeah. Says the Gemara, when Rav Yosef says his line of Hakol Modim, we know, as David just highlighted, that not everybody holds this way. So when we say Man Hakol Modim, who are you referring to behind the scenes? It's kind of like one of those things where, like, had we really been like intimately familiar with all of this, we would have been like, who's he talking about? Something's going on here. That should kind of be as learners, that should be our reaction. Be like, wait, not Hakol Modim. Everybody knows not Hakol. So what is the line coming to teach us? It says the Gemara to teach us about Rabbi Yoshua. Tiafal gavdam Rabbi Yoshua. Ein mamzer mechayve kares mechayve krisus. That when there is a tashmish amita with a chayve krisus, I should say a little better. When there is tashmish amita that is chayv kares, then it's not a mamzer. Nehida mamzer lo have. Even he would agree that in this case, while it's true that there's no mamzerus, but pagum have, he would still agree that with the chayve krisus, even though lemaisa he doesn't hold this way, Yeshua holds that it's not considered mamzerus. Doesn't matter. We would still say that there's a pagam. How do we know? Mikal v'chomer from almana me'almana. Almana lekohen gadol she'ena isura shava b'chol. By her, that her Isser is very unique in the initial phase where she's only limited to the Kohen Gadol. So then by her we say it's B'nai Pagum, Zoshi Isura B'chol, Eino Din Sheb'nai Pagum. Then in our case of Chayve Krisus, for sure it should be the case. And that's across the board. The din of Tashmish with Chayve Krisus, with a Tashmish Amita that is Chayv Kares is of course across the boards. And if you want to say that there's a uniqueness, like we saw above, here you can't say that the Kal V'chomer doesn't apply. Above, we said that the Kal V'chomer doesn't compare from the case of Almana to the case of Machzir Grushaso. But here, the Kal V'chomer does work. Here, the Kal V'chomer works because when the almana has tashmish amita, so then she's mischaleles, and hachanami here by the case of chayve krisus, kevan sheba'ala asa azona. Once tashmish amita took place with this, in this case, she's considered a zona. Rashi says, dibur amaschal asa azona, 6 lines from the bottom of the page, and with this we'll stop. What does Rashi say? Asa azona upsala lekahuna. Okay, and that's what really the Rashi is speaking about a little bit more. You can't give this same answer above because machzir grushaso doesn't turn her into a zona. But here, by the chayve krisus, it does. So therefore, we seem to have a valid approach to Rav Yosef. And Rav Yosef's line is that he's just saying that whenever there's chayve krisus, even according to Rabbi Yoshua, holds that there is no mamzerus, but still, the child is going to be considered pagum. We'll stop right here. Tomorrow, we'll jump into the sugya of Eved v'Oved Kochav Mabal Bas Yisrael Shavlad Mamzer, and hopefully we'll come out Lakula so that we don't have a lot of mamzerim running around Klal Yisrael. Wishing you all a beautiful night.